Logan Morse received his doctorate in pharmacy from Ferris State University College of Pharmacy. He practices functional integrative medicine and is dual board certified in anti-aging and functional medicine. He is director of special projects at Keystone Compounding Pharmacy and serves in the U.S. National Guard. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Thank you guys again for having me back. I appreciate you. Some of you I recognize from last time. So super excited. Today we're going to be talking about genomics in your health and understanding the future of personalized medicine. This is actually something that I tend to do a lot with my patients at the pharmacy, and I think you guys are going to be really interested in this. So a little bit about me. So as Susan already said, I graduated from Ferris State, go Bulldogs. I'm the co-owner and director of special projects at Ferris State at Keystone Compounding Pharmacy. I did found a organization called Vital Sprouts, where we support young children and their nutrient depletions. And then I do serve with the Indiana Air National Guard with the 19th CERP. So we oversee chemical, biochemical, radiological, and nuclear warfare. So today, our goals are to understand DNA basics. We're going to be able to describe current genomic technologies. If we don't understand how those technologies work, it's going to be really hard to understand which ones to choose should you ever look into personalized therapy. We're going to identify the impact on health, wellness, including disease, risk, preventative care of 5 important genes. So I took the 5 most that I believe you guys should know. There's millions of genes to look at, and unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through all of them. We're also going to look at treatment strategies to impact those genes, as well as, I don't know why that's on there twice, but as well as looking at how we can go through and do some preventative care. So DNA basics. So first, it's important to understand what is DNA. So DNA is going to consist of 2 long polynucleotide chains. Essentially, it forms this double helix, right? We're all very familiar with, hey, DNA is this double helix model, right? And those polymers are made up of these nucleotides, which are typically things like adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. That's what kind of makes up our DNA. And those, the DNA encodes for proteins. And these proteins are what we would call carrying instructions for the body. So that those proteins tell the body what to do, right? When we have a complete set of this information, that's what's called a genome. So you're going to hear me say genome. You may hear me say gene. Just be cautious as we're kind of going through here, right? And then genes are segments of DNA. So those are some of the basics that we're going to go through. So let's look at current genomic technologies. The first up is going to be DNA sequencing. So there's 2 different styles here. There's next generation sequencing, as well as 3rd generation sequencing. The difference between the 2 is next generation is going to really allow for that full entire genome, whereas the 3rd generation uses real long time kind of sequencing. So it takes a lot longer to do the 3rd generation, but you can be a little bit more specific with it. So that's kind of the nice advantage to it. When we look at DNA sequencing, most of the time you're going to be seeing a lot of the 3rd generation because the next generation, we just don't have the infrastructure to really house it. I mean, we're talking about millions upon millions of data. I mean, it would fill a whole server up pretty quickly. So the next generation typically isn't used too often. Next, we're going to have CRISPR and genome editing. Let's see if I can just... So CRISPR allows for precise targeted changes in DNA. Newer systems can even target RNA. So DNA is when you've got 2 of those polynucleotides, whereas RNA is just a single strip. So if we go back, I'll show you real quick. So if we go back, if we cut this in half, that's going to be just the RNA. Whereas when you have both of them, now you've got your DNA. With CRISPR, we can actually use it to target human disease treatment. So I have a colleague of mine, we were talking about it this weekend. They were actually using CRISPR to target ADHD and try to adjust that in their patients, as well as bipolar disease. So CRISPR, you can look at disease treatment, infectious diseases, food bioengineering. They often use CRISPR for. And what it can do is it helps with base editing and prime editing. So these are technologies that allow you to encode for single bases or make more complex edits into that DNA. So when we talk about those nucleotides, those 4 that I mentioned, you can change those, and that can make adjustments into the DNA. I will. Thank you. Sorry. And so with base editing and prime editing, you can use it to adjust point mutations. That's a key point there, especially for diseases like sickle cell anemia. Then we've got single cell genomics. So single cell RNA sequencing is one of the single cell genomics. And what it does is it profiles gene expression at a single cell level. So when we talk about single cells, we're talking about up to 200 million genes in one cell. So there's a lot of genes in that one cell. You've got spatial transcriptomics, which adds a location based on the context of the gene expression. So if the gene is expressing brown hair, we can adjust that by looking at that specific gene and telling that protein to change it to blonde hair. So if you've ever heard of individuals changing the height, the color of the hair or the eyes of their child, this is where you would be doing a lot of that. So you're looking at the specific gene and changing that gene based on that spatial location. The advantage of doing this is you can actually see where in the gene code to make that edit. So it's really precise, really cool. The downsides to it is you're going to lose a lot of material. And so what that means is you can have dropouts in that sequence, which you don't necessarily want. And that can cause issues. So if we were talking about like a child again, you could actually cause other gene edits because of that loss. So you don't always want to necessarily do that because it can cause errors. Today, we're going to be focusing more on epigenomics, and this focuses on gene expression. So gene expression, once again, is going to be a little bit more of what does that gene do? So for example, one gene expression is if you know somebody who has more anxiety, that individual has a gene that expresses for that more often than what you do. There's also people who you may know that get angry more often or quicker than you do. I tend to call them sharp, but there's other words that we tend to use for that. That's also a expression of the gene that changes how we act and react. So different stimuli like nutrition, metabolic defects, physical activity, oxidative stress, inflammation, and drugs are all responsible for how we present our epigenetics. There's a really important one that's called DNA methylation analysis, which is what we use to understand gene regulation and epigenetic changes in diseases. So we utilize this because methylation is very important for a lot of our body's processes. What methyl groups do is they help with absorption. So when we talk about B vitamins, for example, a methylated B is going to be absorbed better into the system or into the blood than a non-methylated B vitamin. But there are some people who you can give methylated B vitamins to who will go quote unquote crazy because they are already high methylators and you don't need to give them more. It'd be like giving a kid who ate 10 donuts more sugar. You don't necessarily want to give them more sugar. And then you have ATAC sequence and chip sequencing, which analyzes chromatin assembly and transcription factor binding. Next, we have synthetic genomics. which is writing synthetic DNA sequences from scratch. So this is more of that like DNA engineering per se. And this is where we can engineer bacteria or medicines or biofuels. So this is a really important process that we tend not to even think about because we don't realize that it's happening. But for example, when we have certain bacteria that we need to figure out a medication for, this is really important. So we can take the component of maybe a plant that we know that is toxic to this bacteria and steal that component and then re-engineer it into a medication. And now something that I feel like everyone uses these days is AI and genomic data integration, which is essentially you're using a machine learning model and you're plugging in all this genomic information and you're saying, tell me everything you see. And by doing so, you can get these really great interpreted information, and it's used to prevent and predict disease risks, drug response, and other functional variants. So really cool that we have this tool, but also terrifying because AI systems, as you know, can be wrong sometimes. In fact, I had an AI do some citations for me recently for a blog I was writing, and it was for an offsite company. And I was just like, hey, I need you to cite all of these resources in AMA format for me because I would just wanted to be lazy and I didn't want to do it. Well, I plugged it into the article, didn't recheck them. The company came back and said, hey, did you know that your articles don't match up with your titles? So the AI just kind of put things together, but didn't do it correctly. And so I had articles that I didn't even use that were in there. And they're like, can you redo this? I was like, yeah, I'll fix it. So AI is only as good as you train it to be, but the AI and machine learning that they use for genomics is very specific. So now we've got pharmacogenomic and personalized medicine. So this is the last of the types of genomics that we'll kind of talk about. So this is actually using genetic information to personalize medication therapy. There are a lot of different pharmacogenomics that you can run. There's typically three main ones, but this is going to encompass not only proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, and metagenomics. So it includes a lot of different things. And this is going to improve patient outcomes. So a lot of times you'll hear of patients who take a lot of antidepressants or medications that help out with anxiety and depression. And the downside is that they'll try and fail 2, 3, 4 before they find one that actually works well for them. But if we would have ran their pharmacogenomics when they were a baby, we could have said, hey, if Susie Q here ever needs something, this is the medication we should go for first, because this one is going to react the best in the body. Because Susie might break down one of the drugs really fast, or she may not break it down fast at all and it sits in her serum and she could go toxic in it. So knowing this information can be really important for your care. So not only does it improve outcomes, but it is going to be extremely important, I believe, in the future for common clinical practice to utilize. I wasn't quite sure how this slide was going to come out. So these, yeah, it's a little wordy, but biggest thing to take away from this slide, and I'm sure everyone will get a copy of the slides at the end, correct? Yeah. So you'll be able to read this a little bit better once you get the slides. But on the farthest left is
But you don't want to fall down on you either.
and then that gene is going to come and tell you how it impacts all these medications.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
The biggest ones to know are CYP2C19, 2C6 is another one. So these are all really important. And those medications that we talked about earlier, as far as things like anxiety medications or things like antibiotics or pain medications. So those genes are really important to look at. If we were to try to go through each one of these, we would literally have to be here for hours, and I don't want to eat up all of your guys' time today. So next is kind of talking about the genes that I think you guys should know about. Some of these you probably already heard about at least once, or you may, if you watch any or listen to any podcasts or even on TV, they might have been named. So hopefully some of these sound familiar to you. The first one goes by a few different names. So it goes by the MTHFR gene. Some people call it the mother effing gene. If that's what most people will call it by, but it's a really important regulator for both folate and homocysteine metabolism. So this is used in the methylation pathway, which impacts things like cardiovascular health. It can impact chronic fatigue. It's important in pregnancy. So if someone has pregnancy complications, we tend to look at it, neurological issues. And that's because when you're methylating something, you're affecting that B vitamin, and Bs need to be utilized to also help out with homocysteine. And if you have a high level of homocysteine, it's going to increase risk for cardiovascular disease. So looking at my own genome, because I was curious about it, I have a higher level of homocysteine just because of the way my genes are. Well, you can affect that by using B vitamins to help supplement and move that pathway along. And I'll show you that pathway here in a little bit. There's two main studied mutations. So there's a C677T, which generally has just a mild reduced activity. This is what I see most people have. If you have two copies of it, though, your activity at that gene is reduced by 70%. So that's like if you ask me for $1 and I said, here's 30 cents, you're not going to be happy, right? You're going to want that full dollar. So that is a gene, if I see it homozygous, that I am typically quite worried for my patient about how I'm going to help them out. The next one's A1298C, which is usually much more mild than the C6771, especially the homozygous. Homozygous just means you have two of that gene. Heterozygous means that you have one normal and maybe one not normal gene. And it can impact neurotransmitter balance and the detoxification pathways. So some patients, if they drink too much, they have a harder time breaking down alcohol. Well, alcohol is a toxin. And so if they're having a harder time breaking that down, sometimes it can be just the methylation gene or the MTHFR gene. So how do we help patients out who have this? What are some wellness strategies that we can do? So one is utilizing supplementation of methylated B vitamins, right? So a lot of times these people are not methylating. And so once again, methylating just means that you're putting that group, a methyl group, onto whatever the structure tends to be to help out with absorption. You do want to avoid synthetic folic acid. What this causes is what's essentially like a clogging feature. It's very interesting. So synthetic vitamins or even medications, the body is going to have a harder time understanding what to do with it. And if it does that, then it's not going to move into the next step into the pathway process. And so it causes this clogging feature. Eating a folate rich diet. Now, a lot of things are folate enriched, which are typically, from my understanding, sprayed onto foods. Now, those are typically, from what I've read, is synthetic, but I don't do enough into agricultural to know, like, is that always the case? I'm not sure what they have at their disposal. So eating leafy greens, legumes, avocados, asparagus, those are all great resources for folate. Reducing processed foods or ultra processed foods. The best way to explain how to avoid those is if you go shopping at Meijer or Walmart or wherever, don't shop in the middle of the aisles. Stick to the outside where all the fresher foods are at. Trying to eat organic if possible, because GMO foods do have some potential issues with them as far as their nutrient content. So those would be some good tools to utilize. You can do homocysteine testing, so kind of what I described. And that's looking at homocysteine to see what the lab value is. If it's high, typically you can assume that that patient is going to have some sort of methylation issue, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to look further back, and I'll show you that full cycle here in a second. Detoxification support. So this would be using things like okra, or sometimes we can use things like dandelion, or avocados can help with some detoxification. But those are all really great sources. Things like broccoli as well can be really great to help out and support that detoxification process. And lastly, stress management. I mean, how many of you here would say that you have a stressful event at least one time throughout your day, right? hopefully, probably everyone has at least one stressful event, whether it's like, oh, shoot, did I leave the door open when I left home or did I not? So managing stress, a lot of times I just recommend box breathing or breathing exercises to help out with that. And that can be beneficial for impacting the cycle. So this is the methylation and transulfuration pathway. So these two pathways are interconnected. I don't know, it does have one. So here's homocysteine. This is one that we've talked about a few times. If that's elevated, that becomes an issue for cardiovascular disease. If you don't have enough B vitamins, so here's B6 and iron, as well as having serine, you can't go into the transulfuration pathway. And the transulfuration pathway is important for detoxification. The main detoxifying component is glutathione. That's your body's master detoxifier. So when we think about how do we improve detoxification, you want to increase glutathione. The other side of this pathway is looking at folate. So when you have a synthetic folate, it's not its active form, which is the tetrahydrofolate. It actually has to be converted first. So we do that conversion through a few different genes. So there's the SHMT, which utilizes B6 and iron, which then makes 5,10 methyl tetrahydrofolate. And then eventually that goes through, it uses B2 and B3, and then that makes our activated methyl tetrahydrofolate. And then that goes through and helps out with methionine. Individuals who have issues with anxiety will then have issues over here with SAM and SAW. So those two will be unbalanced. And so you can see just how complicated these pathways are. You're talking about one gene, we're talking about this gene right here impacting all of this. But there's all these other genes, the MTR, and to go through all those genes, it would take a lot of time. So really the big one that we look at is MTHFR, which is right here. This is a genomic panel. So this is a panel that I've run on multiple patients. This is just a demo one, so this isn't specific to anyone. But what's really nice about it is you can see not only their MTHFR, so you can see that this one is, they have an active folate deficiency. So they have the CT version. So I talked about the two main mutations. They've got CT, so they've got a partial elevation. But then it's going to go through and it will tell you like, hey, this other gene side, they have an AA as well, is a going to be more of a normal gene. So it came back green. So that's good. But they have all these other genes that you have to look at, right? It'd be like if I went to your house and I only saw one room and that room was really dirty. I'm like, oh man, the rest of this house is going to be dirty, right? But then we walk into the rest of the house and it's super clean, right? So we can't just look at one gene and use that to say, yep, this person has this. You have to look at all of the genes to get a really good idea. And the case presentation at the end will kind of bring a lot of this together. Next, we have the COMT gene, or the catechol methyltransferase. So this is another methyl component. So the CMT gene metabolizes neurotransmitters. So these are monoamines, dopamine. This is going to be norepi as well as epinephrine. So if you guys know what dopamine is right what makes us feel good. So imagine that you have a COMT gene that is rapidly degrading dopamine. So that person's going to feel like crap most of the time, right? They're going to have more depression. So COMT can affect things like mood and anxiety. It can impact ADHD. So when we were talking about that patient earlier from that colleague who was going to use CRISPR to affect ADHD, this is what they were going to try to do, is they were going to try to affect this specific gene. It can impact estrogen-related tissues. So this can be fibroids or breast cancers, as well as sleeping issues or other neurological issues. So a lot of those pathways use dopamine or norepi. If you ever hear somebody who's ever in like a fight or flight mode, I don't know how common that is. This is a gene that can impact that, because people who are in fight or flight, they tend to be have a little bit more anxiety, and that anxiety then fuels cortisol, which then just keeps them in this heightened situation. So COMT can be really important. The most common variant that's studied is a valine to methionine substitution. So Valine and methionine are kind of like side chains onto the gene, and so that's what we specifically look for. So valine is a fast COMT person. So that's somebody who's going to break down dopamine very quickly, for example, or they might break down norepi or epi very quickly. They tend to have lower dopamine levels in the prefrontal cortex, so the brain typically doesn't function as well. They're often calm underneath pressure, but they struggle with focus or multitasking or even just motivation. So they do have some of those struggles in there. If you have somebody who is a methionine genetic component, they're going to be slow COMT. So they're going to be kind of the opposite, right? They're going to have low enzyme activity. They're going to have a lot more dopamine sitting around. So these typical individuals typically think sharper underneath normal conditions, as well as are a little bit more sensitive to stress and can be easily overstimulated. Because they're already having a lot of stimulation to the neurons from all these receptors, right? So if they've got a lot of dopamine and a lot of norepi and a lot of epinephrine, right? There's a lot of stimulation happening to receptors. And so that you can a lot of times see them kind of freak out if like multiple people are talking to them and they've got different sounds going on, and a lot of that stimulation can be not great for them. Preventative care for this is going to vary based on what form they have. Now, I forgot to mention, you can have somebody who is methionine valine. So that would be a normal metabolizer, right? So there are other variants. It's not just, hey, you're either fast or you're slow. There are combinations of the two, but for the sake of the presentation, just mostly focusing on the ones that we would want to watch out for. So for slow methionine COMT, you're going to be looking at limit stimulants, right? You don't want to overstimulate these people because they're already having more issues kind of breaking things down, as well as considering non-methylated. So when we talked about methylation, if you increase the amount that they're absorbing, they're going to have generally more energy, especially if we talk about B vitamins. So imagine that you just gave somebody who's already overstimulated and you give them something that's going to give them more energy. Not a great combination. It's like, once again, giving kids who are all jacked up on donuts cookies. You're like, oh, great, this is going to go well. You're going to want to support their stress management. So this can be breath work or meditation or adaptogenic herbs. So things like ashwagandha or rhodiola or things like holy basil can all be very relaxing and be beneficial for these patients. You do want to watch their estrogen load. So that's going to be limiting plastics or phytoestrogens or phytofoods, things that are going to increase potential estrogen. And you do want to support detoxification for those individuals. And that's because of the way that estrogen gets broken down through the liver. You'll get certain metabolites. The ones that we worry about the most is a 4-hydroxyestrone. And by supporting the liver, you'll actually break that down really well. You also want to make sure that you support the gallbladder. The gallbladder releases bile, and it does what's called conjugation. So it's like getting married, in my opinion, right? So when you conjugate two hormones with bile, they stick together. But then, sometimes we have this component in our GI system called the estrobolome. The estrobolome is like the lady in the red dress. And that husband goes, oh, I wonder if I go over here, what happens? And so that's deconjugation. And so the estrobolome will cause deconjugation. That hormone can be reabsorbed in the intestinal tract, and then that can increase risk for cancers because now you're going to have more metabolites of estrogen around, which can increase your levels of 4-hydroxyestrone. So it is important to see that, and you can see that in several patients if you test them. And then magnesium and glycine can help out with excitability. So glycine is a inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it blocks. So imagine a kid is about to eat a donut or a cookie that already ate a bunch of sugar. If I put my hand in front of their mouth, now they can't eat it, right? So that's essentially what glycine is doing. It's saying, nope, you can't attach to this receptor. For somebody who's a fast metabolizer of COMT, they may benefit from methylated vitamins, right? So you want to give them a little bit more energy because they're going to be a little bit lower on those types of things. They're going to have less of that dopamine. You may want to give them some SAMe for focus and for mood. So if we look back here, so Sammy would be here upon this cycle. So that's why it's important to know that full cycle through there, because you're going to be affecting not only the COMT gene, but now you're also going to be eventually affecting the 8-MTFR, MTHFR gene at the same time. So these genes act together. Catch back up here. You can use dopamine support, so things like tyrosine, B6, and zinc. Those can all be beneficial. There's another agent called mucernapurins, which increases dopamine level. And then regular exercise that can help out, especially with dopamine just naturally, right? That's why they call, like, when runners go out running, they get a runner's high. It's an increase in dopamine is what's really occurring. The next gene that we have is the GST, or the glutathione S transferase family. So when we talked about glutathione earlier, we talked about how it's the master detoxifier. So this is going to be really important in individuals who are exposed to a lot of toxins. So for example, when I mentioned working in the garden, what my unit does, we deal with chemicals, so biochemicals, radiological chemicals. And so those are all things that we could be exposed to. And if you don't know how somebody metabolizes those very well, one of my airmen could go toxic much faster than another one of my airmen. And you may not know what's going on, but somebody could get sick super quickly. So they really struggle with detoxification. Another issue with, you'll hear of like flushing in the Asian population when they drink. They have the issue generally with detoxification. That's a detoxification issue. And so GST helps the body neutralize and eliminate toxins and carcinogens and heavy metals, medications, as well as byproducts of oxidative stress. So things like reactive oxygen species. And they work by attaching toxins to glutathione, right? That detoxifier. There are three main variants. So there's a GSTT1, a GSTM1, and a GSTP1. They all kind of have different functions. So GSTT1 detoxifies environmental toxins and byproducts of oxidative stress. So that's like a byproduct of oxidative stress is if I go running, or if I do a lot of anaerobic exercise, I'm going to increase what's called reactive oxygen species, which is a byproduct of oxidative stress. So kind of think about it that way. If you have a full deletion, you're going to have reduced detoxification capacity. With GSTM1, that's going to handle carcinogens. So think about people who are smokers or work in high levels of pollutants or chemicals. If you have a full deletion there, you have lower glutathione recycling. So our bodies are incredibly intelligent. And so you can utilize glutathione once, and then it breaks down, and the body will say, hey, if I just add this new group to you, I can reuse you. And so it's a recycling of that component. Then lastly, GSTP1, which is active in the brain, lungs, and reproductive organs. And if you have certain SNPs there, you can actually slow down that enzyme activity. So correct. So these components, right, are going to help with different levels of detoxification through the body. So some health conditions that are linked to GST variants. So autoimmune conditions like chronic toxin load. So you may have somebody who is exposed to mold in their house, especially in Michigan. There's a lot of mold in a lot of people's houses that just don't know it. And so they can get mycotoxins. And that could be somebody who's getting a high mycotoxin load. And over time, that can lead to a lot of chronic autoimmune conditions. Multiple chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue. Cancer risks is another one, especially breast cancer, prostate, and lung. So those, especially breast cancer and prostate, those are estrogen-derived cancers. Even though a lot of times people say with prostate, it's testosterone. It's not. It's because testosterone converts into estrogen, and that's why it goes up. And then neurodegeneration, so things of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. That's specifically more GSTP1 in nature. So what are some strategies that we can do 4 GST variants. Well, one is just avoid chemicals, right? So that's avoiding things that have those, so instead of spraying pesticides or plastics or using synthetic fragrances, try to use something natural. I know that it's sometimes difficult and tends to be more expensive, but if we want to protect our health, sometimes, paying a little bit extra to improve longevity or reduce our risk of diseases does pay off in the long run. Filtering your water or your air supply. So there are things out there like reverse osmosis that can help with your water. If we think about air control, there's a product called a halo, and you put it on your furnace and it shoots ultraviolet light onto the air that goes through it. And by doing so, it actually destroys mycotoxins as well as some other potential toxins in the air that you can actually get rid of. Use clean beauty and household products, and then obviously reduce things like alcohol or other drugs, things like smoking tobacco or processed foods. Those are all great ways to do it just without really having to pay too much money. Supplements can help. So we talked about glutathione a lot. Glutathione is a supplement. It comes, preferably a liposomal form is going to be the best absorbed. So a liposome just means that the glutathione is encased essentially in fat. It's probably the easiest way to explain it. And that fat allows for the absorption into tissues because our tissues like fat. So if you've ever put cream on your arm, if you put cream on, it generally takes a little bit longer to get absorbed. Whereas if you put an ointment on, ointments get absorbed a little bit quicker through that skin. So they collect into that skin a little bit better. Acetylated is also okay, but if I had a preference, I would pick liposomal. And acetylcysteine, which you can kind of think about as a precursor to glutathione. So it's like, maybe the best way to put it is, it's like a pizza that you put in the oven, but it's not yet done. But as soon as it's done, now it's completely ready to eat. So N-acetylcysteine is like the pizza that you put in, and when you take it out, now you get glutathione. So it is metabolized into glutathione, if that makes sense. Alpha-lipoic acid is another really great one. Selenium actually is essential for that glutathione recycling. And then things like milk thistle and dandelion can be really important for just the detoxification through the liver. My favorite is actually broccoli sprouts. You don't see them very often, but they're cheap to grow in your house. And they are filled with a bunch of antioxidants. Specifically, it's called sulforaphane. And that can do wonders, especially on things like, if you've ever heard of vitiligo. Vitiligo can actually be halted by certain levels of sulforaphane in the body. So my sister has vitiligo. That's what we use to treat it, and now it's no longer spreading. It's not going to reduce it, but it can at least halt the progress of it. And then diet. So just eating these foods, right? Things like onions and garlic and citrus and berries. All these things that we know have antioxidant properties, right? Vitamin C, for example, that's an antioxidant. Vitamin E is an antioxidant. So those are all really beneficial. And then just hydration. A colleague of mine gave me a really good analogy for when should you drink more water. So one is, we all know the urine test. If your urine is dark yellow, generally dehydrated. Another really good example is if you wake up in the morning and you feel really stiff, when you put your foot down, you feel that real stiffness, you're typically dehydrated. So that stiffness is the tissues not really being hydrated enough to utilize all the components that it needs to use for movement. So I thought that was a really cool, another way to check your hydration level status. Next gene that we're going to be looking at is the monoamine oxidase A. This is a gene that helps with the breakdown of neurotransmitters in the brain. So this is serotonin and dopamine, norepi, as well as melatonin. So how many of you sleep throughout the whole night right now? Right? Now, some of that's going to be age, but the other part of it could be this gene. So if you've always been a bad sleeper, this is a gene that could be impacting that because serotonin is metabolized into melatonin. And so there's a really great connection there. It also helps out with mood and arousal, aggression, and emotional stability. So some health impacts of the MAOA variants are going to be mood disorders, so depression and anxiety, PTSD, susceptibility. So not all PTSD, but some people are going to be more, it's going to be more prevalent in them because of this gene. ADHD, substance abuse or use, aggression or impulsivity under stress. So if you've ever had an argument with somebody and they'll just freak out really quickly and they just snap, typically it's this gene that's impacting that. Sleeping issues. So, right, we talked about melatonin and how that's broken down. There's two main types, and it's a polymorphism that's an LPR. So it's a long, essentially like a long chain portion of the gene that's impacted. If you have high activity, you're typically what's called a warrior off gene. So that breaks down the neurotransmitters very quickly, leads to lower levels of dopamine and serotonin. And this is going to be associated with anxiety and depression and kind of emotional outbreaks. The low activity is called the warrior gene. So this is what, when you think about like a bunch of Vikings going into battle and think about how like crazy they could get about this, typically when they studied, they actually found that those individuals had lower activity. So they could get easily aggressive. So they have higher levels of dopamine as well as norepi. They're associated with impulsivity, aggression, mood swings, especially if they're exposed to trauma or even early in life. So if you've ever seen someone after a traumatic event and they typically are a little bit more snippy about certain things, this could be a potential reason why. It's more common in men. So, right. So once again, when we talked about like Vikings going into battle and them kind of getting very aggressive, this is part of the reasoning behind it, is this gene. So what can we do for this gene? How do we prevent, how can we use some preventative care and wellness strategies? So for individuals who are low activity, you can support them by using calm and focused kind of emotional regulations. So breathing techniques is a great way. Meditation, yoga, things of that nature. Using adaptogens like ashwagandha, holy basil, L-theanine, Relora. I mean, those are all great adaptogens that we can use. We can support the methylation pathway, right? So this is going to help kind of pick them up a little bit. Typically, you'll see other genes like the MTHFR and COMT being sluggish in these individuals as well. So it's not uncommon to see kind of them all affected in a certain way. You do want to avoid stimulants, especially if these individuals are going to be more prone to aggression. And then you can consider giving 5-HTP or tryptophan. So if we talk about the cascading events of these neurotransmitters, you've got tryptophan, which we know comes from turkey, right? Tryptophan converts into 5-HTP. 5-HTP converts into serotonin, and then serotonin converts into melatonin. So you can see how if you're an individual who's impacted by this, you're impacting that whole cascade. But a lot of this is going to depend on their individual chemistry. For somebody who's high activity, you may need to support dopamine as well as give them serotonin support, SAMe, methylfolate, B6. These individuals can benefit from dopamine boosting activities, so exercise or creative work. So a lot of artists, you can actually improve them by saying, hey, I need you to make me a painting for XYZ, and they can be as creative as they want. You do need to watch for blunted mood or low motivation, and those individuals may need some more support, especially in high stress settings. So if you're somebody who's into a high stress job, you know, for example, if you were to take my military work that I do, and there was a mass bombing, right? That's going to be a high stress event going into that. And if there's somebody who has high activity, you want to make sure that you're supporting them in that time. ApoE is the next gene that we're going to be looking at. So it's apolipoprotein E. This is a very important gene to understand. And this is going to impact a lot of different things like brain health and Alzheimer's disease, cholesterol levels, cardiovascular disease, inflammation, and oxidative stress. And so these are the main variants that you're going to see: E2, E3, and E4. If you're double E2, you're going to have more protection against those kind of conditions. If you're double E3, that's what's considered normal. But if you have double E4, that's when you're going to have substantial increase in risk. So some people are E2, E3, they kind of have some of the benefit. Some people are E3, E4, so they're a little bit more negative. So you can have a combination of these genes. And a lot of it depends, right, on the genetics that are passed down from you from your mother and father. It's very important in the lipid metabolism, especially into the brain. So when we think about, hey, I have high cholesterol. If you were born, and let's say in the early teens, you checked your cholesterol level and you had a generally healthy diet, but your cholesterol was really high, this is the gene that I would be looking at. Or if you're eating well and you're exercising and you still can't get your cholesterol down, this is a gene I would be looking at. Or if you have a family history of dementia or Alzheimer's, this is the gene I would be looking at. So it's incredibly important to look at. We kind of already mentioned what we're looking at for it, but Alzheimer's disease, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, these are all very, very good to know. So here's more of the genotypes. So when we look at Alzheimer's risk with ApoE, if you have that E4 variant, that's a 10 to 15 times higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, not all of these genes are guarantees. Just because you have E4 doesn't mean that you're going to have Alzheimer's. It just means that you're at an elevated risk. I want to make that really clear because individuals will look at their genetics and then they'll be like, well, I'm going to have ADHD because my genes tell me so. And it's not true. It's just that they're at an elevated risk. There are things that you can do to modify those. E2 is the most protective. Once again, just because you're E2 doesn't mean that you can't get Alzheimer's or dementia. It just is going to protect you a little bit better. But the most common is E3. That's the one I see probably the most when I check my patients. With Alzheimer's pathology, we talked about E4. This also influences inflammation. So dementia is an inflammatory process, causes inflammation in the brain. It impacts the blood-brain barrier integrity. So that integrity, right? Kind of the best way to describe it is imagine that you have a hose and you're letting water out. But all of a sudden the hose stops pushing water very well. So you put your finger over top of it. Well, not spraying out much faster, but if you shoot that spraying hose now at the ground, you can cause more damage. Same thing happens in the brain. When you impact that blood-brain barrier, you can actually cause more damage to the brain itself. And it also impacts lipid metabolism in the brain. For cardiovascular effects, you're going to see higher levels of HDL and LDL and cholesterol, triglycerides. Sometimes you will, once again, see those patients that you're like, I don't understand why my cholesterol is high. Those individuals are also going to be at higher risk for having plaquing in their arteries, as well as strokes and aneurysms and things of that nature. So you do want to be very careful to look at this, especially if you have a family history. So for example, every male in my family dies in their 60s, every single one of them. My dad passed at 64, his dad passed at 61, his grandfather passed at 63. I've looked at my genes and it's not looking great for me either. So it's important to see those trends. And that's why you ask your patients, do you have a family history of this? Because you can kind of figure out, hey, this person probably has this gene. You'll hear of lineages of people who are like, yeah, my mother had dementia early. And like, oh, my grandma had that too. And her grandma. That's really weird. We want to look at these genes early so that we know what our risks are. So some preventative care strategies. So if you carry the ApoE4, this is the one that, once again, is going to put you at increased risk. You want to prioritize low inflammatory diets. So like a Mediterranean diet is a great one to look at. You want to focus on healthy fats. So these are things like olive oil or fish oil. You do want to avoid saturated fats if you can. You also want to be careful about foods high in sugar. So you want to avoid that because these individuals are typically a little bit more insulin sensitive. Exercising regularly is going to be important. Sleeping well, and when I say sleeping well, I mean at least 8 hours. There's not too many people, honestly, that can be like, oh, I always get 8 hours of sleep. I know for me last night, I think I got like 4. I was coming back from Indiana, so it was a long night for me, but, and then supporting the detoxification pathways, especially COMT, GST, and MTHFR. So you can kind of see all these genes are starting to kind of go together. So it's important. That's why we look at all of them. Some supplement tips that I would have, using things like omega-3s, curcumin, magnesium, specifically with magnesium is threonate. That one, now I will say, that one's the only one that's studied to cross the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't mean that's the only magnesium that goes into the brain. If that was true, we'd all be dead. So that one's the only one that's studied for brain use. But magnesium glycinate, magnesium malate, magnesium taurate, those are all great magnesiums that can help with the brain function. B vitamins, once again, especially if they're having issues with the MTHFR gene, and then CoQ10, which is going to help out with mitochondrial support or energy support. What are we doing on time? Good. So I wanted to go through a patient case of mine. This patient is ML. She's a 30-year-old white female. She came in to see me. She was overall healthy, is what she told me. But you'll kind of see some interesting things. She currently eats a standard American diet or a SAD diet with limited exercise. She came to me because she wanted to lose 25 pounds. I said, cool, let's do it. We looked at some of her labs. She had elevated cholesterol, 273. Her LDL was 181. Her blood pressure was 128/94, but she had a history of normal and abnormal readings. Now, I would argue that probably 90% of healthcare providers cannot take an accurate blood pressure. So my guess is that her readings are probably not accurate, and she's probably more abnormally high than what's being reported. She has a family history of early cardiovascular deaths. So her mother died of a stroke, and then her grandfather died of a stroke very young. She was easily irritated. She was talking about, her morning with her neighbor, and the neighbor shut the door too hard, and she was like, I'm so pissed at the neighbor, blah, blah. And I was like, it was one time, right? And then she has a history of anxiety and depression. So one of the things that I kind of thought about was, okay, why are family members dying so early? What is going on there? And so we checked her genomics. And so the test that I ran is called a Cardia-X. Cardia-X goes through and it tests all sorts of genes. There's a lot of genes that we didn't talk about that are going to be on here, and I'm not going to go through too much of this. Really, what I want you guys to look at is what are the risks associated with these genes for this patient. So this patient is at a higher risk for abnormalities in blood flow. Well, that's important because our blood carries all of our nutrients. It carries everything that we need our brain to function, our muscles to function. This patient's at higher risk for atrial fibrillation. Oh, well, that's not good. This patient's also at elevated risk for altered blood pressure. Once again, now we're starting to see this case of this patient's probably going to have a lot of cardiovascular risks. That's not all. They also have a elevated risk for myocardial infarction twice. And they're looking at 2 different SNPs or polymorphisms on this gene, this 9p21. And so when there's more than one, typically they're going to be a little bit more elevated risk. Once again, we've got more genes here that are all pointing towards myocardial infarction. They've got an altered gene function here, which impacts different mutations for cardiovascular care. I won't go too deep into it. They have issues with elimination, systemic elimination. So this is a patient that's probably higher toxin load, for example. So now you have imagine, I have bad blood flow, potentially. I have altered risk for blood pressure. I don't carry things in and out of the system great. I'm going to have more toxins in my blood that are going to just sit around the pool. They're also at risk for glutamic acid ratio. I won't go into that information, but that just means essentially that they're at a higher risk for coronary heart disease. And so they should eat more fruits and vegetables. sorry, this test is really long. It goes through a lot of genes, but it's really important to understand. They're at elevated increased risk for homocysteine. So we talk about homocysteine and how that impacts cardiovascular health. They were at increased risk for caffeine intake. So this person actually has a gene that will cause them to be more essentially addicted to caffeine or more easily like stimulated by caffeine. If you increase caffeine intake, you also increase blood pressure. So they're addicted to caffeine. They're going to also have that issue. Once again, they have another gene that codes for altered blood pressure, which is an increase. They have reduced nitric oxide levels or an increased risk for nitric oxide, low nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is what expands blood vessels. So as you can imagine, if we use the hose analogy again, what do you do to increase the pressure on your hose so you can shoot the water farther? Well, you put your finger over top of it. Well, same thing in the body. When we need to increase the amount of blood that we're getting to a specific spot, well, we constrict the blood vessel by, we've got muscle around our blood vessels and it constricts and that shoots more pressure. Well, just like going to the gym, the longer that you stay in that, utilizing that muscle to get the blood to get where it needs to go, the harder it is for that blood to now expand. So not only do you have an issue expanding the blood vessel because you've got strength in the muscle, but you have less nitric oxide used to expand to help out with blood flow that way. They're increased risk for thromboembolisms, so they can have more clotting. So if you've ever heard of a DVT or a deep vein thrombosis, this individual is at a higher risk for that as well. This patient has a CT gene on the ApoA2. So ApoA2 is a little bit different than the one that we talked about, but essentially they're going to have lipid abnormalities, so increased risk for having more lipids. So you can kind of see this person has high risk for a cardiovascular event in their future. Now, it doesn't mean that they will have one, but they're at high risk. They have an impaired RAS system. So RAS affects blood pressure, essentially. So what did I do for this patient? We have somebody who's extreme high risk for a cardiovascular event in their future. Doesn't mean that they'll have one once again, but they're at a highly high risk. So I started them on a lipid-lowering anti-inflammatory and vessel-improving over-the-counter supplement. I didn't want to go too deep into supplements as far as like which specific one, because I'm not trying to promote them right now. As far as what I use. We started a cardiometabolic food plan, and I always say food plan versus diet. Diets seem restrictive. Food plans essentially just means follow and eat the foods on here, but you can eat them in any way or shape or form you want to eat them. Exercise for 30 minutes of cardiovascular 4 times a week. And then I had her do resistance training 4 times a week. So one, I wanted to improve the amount of dopamine she had because she struggled with anxiety and depression. And 2, I also wanted to shuttle and use up as much cholesterol as possible. So it's going to break that down a little bit more and be beneficial there. And then I did start her on a vitamin D supplement because she wasn't taking any and she lives in Michigan. And the likelihood that her vitamin D was normal is probably 0. In 12 weeks, we saw her cholesterol go from 273 to 177, which was a 35% reduction. Her LDL went from 181 to 117, which was, again, a 35% reduction. She lost 14 pounds. And a lot of that was just she was holding on to toxins, and that was increasing weight. She had improved energy and potentially improved longevity, right? We never know. We can do a lot of these things for our patients, but if she were to live to 73 or 80, I'll never know. So today we covered the basics of DNA. We talked about current genomic technologies. We identified the impact on health and wellness, including disease, preventative care of 5 important genes. And we went through some treatment strategies for impacting those genes. This is my contact information. You can always feel free to reach out. And here are my references. Yes, these ones were checked. What questions do you guys have? I'll start up here and I'll work back.
All of this genetic, epigenetic, and molecular biology is so new for somebody in my age group. Two questions. Number one, is my personal epigenetic makeup locked in at birth, or does that tend to change due to my environment?
It can change due to your environment, especially the expression of those epigenetics. And those are what we typically try to alter, because it's very hard, right, to change genes, but you can, in genes, sometimes gene expression, but the epigenetic expression can be modulated by supplements, environmental changes, things of that nature. So,
second question is, I go for an annual blood test every year. My doctor sends me to do that. How much of what you just covered today is revealed by that standard blood test?
standard blood tests, you probably won't see much as far as like the genetic side. You can guess what's kind of going on based on some things in the regular blood screening. So for example, if I see somebody who's low vitamin B, or they have, symptoms with low vitamin B, and then they have higher cholesterol, even though they're telling me that they eat really great. And I always have them take pictures of what they're eating versus like telling me, because pictures tell me a lot more about what they're actually putting in their mouth. You can kind of pull some of those ideas together. There are lab testings that would look deeper into that, and their physicians can test for it as well. So they could put an ApoE, they could do an apolipoprotein B, they can look at things like LPA. Those are all tests that you can run. Boston Heart Lab does a really good job of a really good cardiovascular panel, and that would give you all that information. But they're all tests that the doctor can order. Whether or not it's covered by the insurance, that's a whole different story. Yep.
Hi, I'm 65 and I've managed to avoid taking any of the drugs for the American diet. And I just had a meeting with my doctor, and my cholesterol was still a little high, and he'd already had me on a halfway vegan diet.
Mhm.
So I'm going to a 5 days a week to try to avoid it. And is there some way for me to, he talked about genes possibly influence this, but he's not done any genetic testing. So I've got a family history of genetic testing, strokes, and I'm wondering, am I in the APOE zone, and should I take that into account? And I would rather know than not know.
Right. Right.
So assuming it's not on insurance, what are the typical commercial rates for if I wanted to order this myself to get a cardiacs or whatever?
So a cardiac X test, I want to say is right around $350. Now, the information that I showed was only the information that was bad. I didn't show you any of the good information, because the test is very long. And so a lot of those tests can be adjusted for whatever you're looking for. So let's say somebody wants to just find out their methylation pathway. You can just test methylation. Now,
And only pay $100 or?
it's going to be anywhere from, if you just checked the gene, sometimes it's anywhere from $35 to $180, depending on the testing source and where you go. And that all gets impacted.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have two quick questions. It's talking about hydrating. What about that Brita water system? Is that a good thing? Sort of, but I also read too that if you take the filter from your sink, your faucet, and clean it out once in a while, but there could be deposits in there. And so I don't want to drink bottled water all the time with all the waste. So is
Right.
this Brita okay, or?
I would say a Brita is going to be better than tap. There are better, like reverse osmosis. Like if I had to choose, I'd pick reverse osmosis because you're going to get a lot of toxins and metals out of the water. But I would say have your water tested first, find out what's in your water, and that's going to give you a better idea of kind of best next steps. If it's heavily filled with, things like iron and other heavy metals, I'd probably just put on a reverse osmosis system, honestly. And a lot of those water tests you can actually get some of them for free that will test your water for you.
And then one quick question, for your labs, for this genetic, is that testing that's done, like at Howard Hospital, or you can send, like my husband has some tests done, they send it out to California. And he had the whole gamut of the autoimmune stuff tested there. So are there special labs that do all these tests? Or is
Yeah,
it
yep.
just
So that was the Cardia X is through a company called Vibrant Labs. So they do home testing, or you have to get like blood drawn. Luckily, for anyone that lives in Holland, Holland is the one draw location that can do it. Holland Hospital can do it. But that's the only site on the west side of Michigan that draws for Vibrant. But some of them, some of those tests, like the Cardia X, you can even do a blood spot from home. So you just poke your finger, you'll put your blood on there, and then they can take that. I have been to their lab, which is really cool. So they use IBM technology, and they put the blood then onto these little pucks or like discs, and then those discs go through, and then they pull all this data from it. And it's fascinating and way above my head, because I mean these guys are, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but these guys are like way bigger nerds than I am, and they were like so excited to show me this puck, and I was like, I don't even know what that puck is, but it's really cool. So it's a really great facility. They do a good job there. So.
About sleep. Dream patterns, do any dreams have any effect on your sleep time that would affect any of your life? I mean, I have some that are very vibrant and I want to go back to it, kind of thing. But then sometimes I just don't have dreams at all. So I'm wondering if they have any impact on.
I don't necessarily have an answer for that. I don't go into too much details on like REM sleep versus non-REM, and it's just not where my specialty lies. What I can tell you as far as like why would you have a vivid dream versus not a vivid dream is going to be due to the amount of like dopamine that you have in the system. So more dopamine, you're going to typically have more vivid dreams. That's why certain medications like amitriptyline or even naltrexone, they increase dopamine and they can cause more vivid dreams. So for example, my dad was on amitriptyline for some neuropathy he was having in his leg. The first time he took it, he told me he saw the world being born. And he's like, I'm never taking that again. I can't blame him because I'm sure that would be terrifying. But so, that's likely why you'd have vivid dreams versus non-vivid dreams. But I'm just, it's not my specialty. So, yes, sir.
Last week, I chanced upon a write-up on the benefits of some medicinal plants. And the author also talked about some more common products from those plants, including onions and garlic. You also mentioned curcumin as being a supplement that can be used, and curcumin is found in foods. My question is this: how much does one have to eat to get the benefits from many of those compounds? And in the case of products like onions and garlic, doesn't that become somewhat objectionable at high concentrations?
To answer the last part, yes, high concentrations. A lot of times it's not so much like the volume, but the consistency. So as far as volume wise, typically for like garlic and onions is anywhere from a quarter a cup a day, even down to a couple tablespoons. Depends on who you ask. Everyone has a different opinion on it. But it's consistency. So doing that every day is going to be more important than eating a whole onion, for example. The other side of it for like curcumin goes, curcumin is very poorly absorbed in the gut. And so you would have to ingest a lot. So when we talk about things like curcumin or even garlic and onions and things of that nature, we want to look at how do we improve absorption rate. And that's why they add things like black pepper, or they use liposomal forms, or they'll use like volatile oils to help with those absorption rates of those compounds. The other side of curcumin, and I didn't go into too much detail on that, but you don't want to just use curcumin. You want to use the whole turmeric root, because there's different antioxidants in the whole root versus just curcumin by itself.
The whole turmeric root is not well known by most people and hard to find.
It is. There are certain products that do have it. So one product is called Tariva. It's by a company called Orthomolecular. They have a full turmeric root complex. It's one of the few that do have it. Otherwise, you'll only typically see curcumin longa as the most common in most supplements.
And while I have the floor, I'll ask another question. In your slides, you made a reference to adaptogens. You
Yep.
didn't explain what they are.
Sure. Yeah. So adaptogens are essentially plants that impact levels of neurotransmitters. So, or they impact mood, or they have some sort of mental adjustment to the body. So, for example, if we take ashwagandha, ashwagandha is probably at one point a few years ago, it cured everything. But ashwagandha is really good at impacting cortisol. And so by impacting cortisol, you reduce anxiety, depression. So the adaptogen portion is just, it's a herb or root that impacts mood function by impacting neurotransmitters. It's the best way to explain it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so how did your patient get to you? Do you have a clinic? How does somebody come and say, check all my everything?
So most patients hear about me through word of mouth. I don't typically like market myself or anything like that.
You're private.
Yeah, so I practice right out of Keystone Pharmacy. So I don't typically staff anymore. I primarily just see patients all day. And so typically for her, it was a mother referral. Her mom came and saw me for a different issue, and then referred me to her. And then unfortunately, her mother had passed recently. So that's why her mom had told her, you need to go see him. She waited, mom passed. And now she's one of my patients. Yes, sir.
Very early on in your presentation, you talked about something that some of us call designer babies.
Yes.
How much of that is actually occurring at this point?
From my knowledge, not very much of it. The only individuals who can afford it are essentially the ultra wealthy, right? Or individuals who are trying to manipulate the genome so that their children can be more athletic and have, better outcomes, whether it's intelligence rating or, they specifically want blue eyes or blonde hair or, whatever it happens to be. But I don't know too much about that, to be honest. So I'll have to look into that. But yeah, it's not very common, but it's primarily just the ultra wealthy that can afford it because it's extremely expensive. Yes, ma'am.
Can you at some point put your information back up on the
Oh, yeah,
screen so that we
absolutely.
can take a photo of it? And so you're in Grand Rapids.
Yep. So we're at the corner of Cascade and East Paris where it tees up. There's Jimmy John's and I want to say like a Supercuts that's right next to us. We're kind of sandwiched in between the two. On our website, I know the question was kind of like if someone was trying to like see you, how would they see you? There's a tab on our website. So it's keystonerx.com that has consultations available. And typically I see patients in person, but I will see patients telehealth if needed. Typically the reason why I want to see patients in person is I don't have all their lab work, and the beauty of having their cell phones on them is we can log in and look at their lab work, and that's really helpful. Otherwise it's a lot of hypothetical situations like my cholesterol's high, and I say, well, how high is your cholesterol? And then they say, well, I don't know. Like 200 to me is really not that high, but if you told me your cholesterol level was 400, I'd be like, we've got some work to do. So that's kind of how that process works.
And secondly, I've just finished a book on iodine, like why we need it. And you didn't mention that at all in your presentation, but a lot of things you said really connected with what I've just been reading this book. Is that something you ever look at? Because this doctor said that 96% of his patients, which are in Michigan, are deficient in iodine, and how important it is to every single cell in your body.
Yep. I'm assuming that was at Dr. Brownstein.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. So I actually just chatted with Dr. Brownstein 2 weekends ago. We talked a lot about iodine. Do I think that a lot of patients could benefit from iodine for multiple different reasons? Yes, I do think so. My issue is how much iodine and how high is high. Because you can do a lot of damage to somebody if you give them too much iodine. You can essentially cause them to go and have issues with their thyroid if you give them too much. So I agree with a lot of what Dr. Brownstein says. Some of his practice materials, I don't necessarily agree with totally because I'm a little bit nervous on some of the dosing that he uses. And that's no fault of his own. He's had a really great success rate with his patients and does really great. But as far as my comfortable level with some of the dosing that he does, I'm just not comfortable with some of it. But iodine is incredibly important.
What portion of your patients see you for physical health reasons and what portion for mental health reasons?
It's a great question. So I'm going to answer your question indirectly. So I would say about 70% of my patients see me for perimenopause or menopausal needs. The other 30% are typically just overall health and well-being. So whether they have anxiety, depression, that they're just trying to optimize and kind of improve, whether it's, children who have chronic autoimmune conditions. So that's kind of the smaller side of my practice. But primarily perimenopause and menopause is what I typically see. Some andropause. Obviously, those are both two subsets of conditions that aren't talked about enough, in my opinion, especially both male and female sexual health, especially as we age into it. I did a presentation probably about a month ago on female sexual health. And one of the questions I asked was, how many of you have ever talked to your doctor about your sexual health? And out of the 50 individuals, not a single hand went up. Now, could that have been because they were shy and didn't want to raise their hand about it? Maybe, but every time I've ever talked to a patient in my practice, I ask them that same question. Have you talked to your provider about this? No, I haven't. And so those conversations just aren't happening. And so that's why those patients end up coming to me because one, either they don't have those conversations with their provider or they feel uncomfortable, or the provider just shuts them down and just says, well, Susie, you're 65. Like, you don't need to worry about it. But unfortunately, estrogens and progesterones, and we have these receptors all through our body, and they're incredibly important, even for men. Testosterone is incredibly important as well as progesterone. A lot of times we don't even look at progesterone in men, which we should. So it's kind of an indirect and kind of a thing as far as, in the aging population, make sure you're looking at your hormones, whether it's for hormonal health, whether it's for anti-aging properties, whether it's for, lowering your risk for prostate cancer. There's so many different benefits of actually looking at your levels. And that could be that's a whole different I could talk about that for hours. But that's kind of a long answer for your question. Sorry.
How do you prescribe calcium? Do you manufacture a pill or powder or
So
drink?
I might get burned for this one, but I don't ever recommend calcium. Most people get enough calcium through their diet because almost all of our food is calcium enriched. Now, when a patient tells me, hey, I have osteoporosis or osteopenia, my doctor told me to take calcium, I say, well, let's look at your calcium level. Let's see what's in your blood first. And then they show me their blood level, and their blood level's normal. And I say, well, Susie, you don't need more calcium, because if you increase more calcium, you're going to cause issues with your parathyroid, which is going to freak out and not know what to do with that calcium. Then it's going to store it in the blood vessels. So we have to consider, what is bone made out of, right? It's proteins, it's things like phosphorus, it's things like magnesium. So if you were baking me a cake, I wouldn't just give you eggs, right? You need flour, you need butter, you need all these other ingredients. So I'd look at that first and say, okay, well, are you getting enough protein in your diet? And there's a protein level that you can run on pretty much every standard physical they'll run. So I don't typically recommend calcium for that reason. It's just too often it's a normal level, and you can actually use, what I would probably recommend would be vitamin K2, specifically MK7. MK7 is the K2 that helps store calcium into the bone. So now we can shuttle that calcium that's in the blood into the bone. We still need to monitor the level, but taking too much calcium is not a good thing.
in terms of autoimmune diseases, I know you said that there's the genetic component, but do you have any recommendations in terms of general nutrition or supplements for somebody that's facing some of those issues?
That's a complicated question just because it depends on what autoimmune. But with most autoimmune conditions, vitamin D is going to be incredibly important. Fish oil is going to be incredibly important. Looking at their GI health, so their microflora is going to be really important, because the gut is essentially our second system, second brain. And so if they're having issues with vitamin B absorption, or if they're having issues with inflammation and leaky gut issues, once again, that's a whole another gambit of things, but that's where I would look at first. And then depending on what type of autoimmune condition and the severity, let's say fibromyalgia, for example, I would probably end up recommending something called low-dose naltrexone, which is naltrexone is a kind of a medication used for opioid abuse or alcohol abuse. But with any medication, right, when we study it, we find out at different doses, it does different things. And so low-dose naltrexone actually helps with modulating the immune system. So where it's not as active, it increases dopamine. And it's a really good anti-inflammatory. So for example, like we put my dad on low-dose naltrexone for his psoriasis. Now, because it's also anti-inflammatory, it's going to reduce inflammation in the gut. He couldn't open up his hands. It was extremely painful for him. After 127 days, he could open up his hands fully. He went from sleeping 2 hours a night to sleeping 7 hours a night. Now, did it work on his neuropathy? I mentioned that earlier. No. So when he was younger, he broke his ankle. The bone died. They cut off his ankle. They put in cadaver bone, refused it together, and essentially fried all of his neurons. So it's essentially like a complex regional syndrome, essentially, which is very difficult to treat. Now, did it lessen some of it? Yeah, he said it helped, but still felt like he was having burning electricity on his foot all the time. So it doesn't fix everything, but it is very beneficial. The downside to low-dose naltrexone is it takes a long time for it to work. Typically 90 to 150 days to find out if that's the optimal dose for the patient. And the reason why it takes so long is, imagine that you have a forest fire, and you have a garden hose and you're trying to put it out. That forest fire is going to continue to burn while you're slowly spraying it out. It's going to take time. And then eventually you're going to get caught up to a point where that fire is very small, and now you're going to have improvement in symptoms. Some patients don't do great on it. So typically the dosing, you would titrate up to 4.5 milligrams, and then you would stay there until they kind of reach that optimal day. So like my dad was 127 days. Some patients it's much sooner, some patients not so much. Sometimes you'll go to 4.5 milligrams and the patient will lose all the benefit. And then you have to go back down to 3 milligrams or 3.5. And so it's a tricky medication sometimes to use, but it can be very beneficial.
A year ago, the Wyoming VA discontinued prescribing and recommending carrying fish oil, citing negative effects. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so with fish oil, there can be negative effects as far as toxin load. So a lot of fish oils, if they're not processed correctly, can be high in heavy metals, which, and if you're ingesting more heavy metals, will lead to more cardiovascular issues. And so that's where a lot of those studies came out saying, don't take fish oil because it's bad for you. But that's not true. You got to make sure that it's triple distilled. So it should say that on the bottle somewhere. If you triple distill fish oil, you'll remove all the heavy metals out of it. The other side is the quality of fish oil. Fish oil, when it's manufactured, shouldn't have any smell or taste. If you taste a fishy taste in a fish oil, or if it smells bad, it's rancid. And so now imagine, like if I brought you an apple that was covered in mold, you wouldn't eat it, right? It's the same thing. You wouldn't want to put a rancid fish oil in your body. So quality really does impact. So those studies, unfortunately, they're heavily biased because they didn't state what products that the patients were using, how they were using them. They didn't provide any certificates of analysis on the product. So it's kind of inconclusive. But fish oils are incredibly important, especially for cellular health. And when we look at all of our organ systems, all of our organs are made up of cells. And so our cell membrane is full of what's called phospholipids or fatty components. And fish oils help replace that and can help strengthen those cellular membranes. And the way I always explain it is when your cell membrane is funky, it's like taking a cell phone and crushing it. At that point now, you can't text somebody, you can't call somebody, you can't communicate. So when the cell membrane's all impacted, you lose that communication. And so a lot of times you'll actually have patients who will have impacts in memory and cognitive function during that time. And you can easily fix it with fish oil or phospholipids, things like phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine can all be beneficial for that cellular membrane as well.
Just a question. I think one of the VA issues with the fish oil was that they were seeing a higher incidence of AFib users. Can you speak to why that might have been?
So with fish oil, it can act as an anticoagulant. Now, typically you don't see that until someone is taking more than 4 grams per day. Under 4 grams, we typically don't see any increase in blood thinning, which technically in AFib wouldn't be a bad thing if their blood was a little bit thinner. But as far as increased risk for AFib, I don't know why they were seeing that. I'd have to read the study.
Yeah.
I'm just not as familiar with it. I would guess it was likely, it's probably due to the quality of the fish oil is my guess. I'm not a big fan of krill. The only reason I say that is I don't think that it's really any better than fish oil. And there's only a few studies on krill oil, and they're fairly biased, in my opinion, just based on who supported the study and how the studies were done. There's a lot more information on fish oil. Now, the other way that you can get omega-3s is through algae. So for people who are trying to stick to a vegan diet, using algae is how you can get some of those omega-3s in. Data on that's also kind of limited, but sometimes if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it is a duck. So as long as the data looks okay, you can use it. But so, you know, if I had a preference, I would pick fish oil, but krill oil can be used. It's just the studies, in my opinion, aren't that strong.
I think that's it.
Thank you very, very much. We really enjoyed your presentation today.